Hey everybody, I'm Caroyln Ghosh. I'm an analytics engineer at DBT Labs. My fun fact, I memorized the Nestle Toll House chocolate chip recipe just through repetition. I'm not going to repeat it here because I'm going to make everyone too hungry, but feel free to get at me in the Slack channel. So I work on our professional services team. I work with a number of large, small, in-between clients who have used DBT for years or are just starting to use DBT. So all perspectives are welcome. I was a in-house analytics engineer at a large organization before I came to DBT. So I have a lot of experience kind of working with different types of teams on data. And so excited to jump into this discussion because I have spent, probably many weeks of my life digging into data quality issues.
Thank you so much for being a part of the event tonight. I'm really glad you're in the room to have this discussion with us. I'm just going to go ahead and start asking both of you some questions. And actually, I'll start with Caroyln. If you had to list out the top 3 data quality concerns that analytics engineers feel most frustrated by, what would those be?
I would say pipelines had tended to be a major source of frustration. More recently, with the modern stack, pipelines are less of a headache. We can get our data from source systems into our warehouse much more reliably than we used to. One thing I would say, one of the 3 would probably be a lack of or poor data validation within source systems themselves. Maybe you're banging your head against the wall because Salesforce really should have a validation rule that for a pick list that, can only be certain values. That's one thing. So issues of like homonyms and synonyms. So like homonyms being the same word being used for different things in a business, and then synonyms, different words being used for the same thing within a business. So that can be really tricky with data quality and kind of making sense of it. And then the lack of automated testing and documentation, which DBT does fantastic in terms of testing sources, in terms of testing transformations and models, but understanding kind of within the source system itself, when are things changing and how do we understand how they're changing? That is really tricky in the analytics engineering perspective. Sometimes we'll just have to go to a team direct, to finance directly and say, hey, why is this number looking so different? So those would be my top 3.
Josh, what are the top 3 for data engineers, top 3 data quality frustrations?
We definitely do at Databand live in more of the data engineering domain than the analytics engineering domain. And I think a lot of my assumption and priors is that these different constituents are thinking about data quality in really different ways. I think that is true. I think what's pretty common within our user base as well, that's another factor, is we work with a lot of companies that deal with lots of different sources of data. It's a pattern that we have in our user base, something that we've seen kind of evolve from companies starting to adopt our solution. And I think that just puts more acute pain on really understanding what's happening from the source. And we have a consistent thread within our users that it feels like when we're in the DBT layer or the transformation layer, it feels like things are a little more under our control. We kind of have more visibility, more ability to enforce rules there, to create our own kinds of tests. The domain feels a little more within our house. And what's more challenging is to understand what's going on with all the source providers that are delivering the data in. I think another pattern that we see is a lot of companies that we work with, not just working with lots of different data sources, but sometimes working with low-tech data sources, just getting data deliveries from some outside provider that maybe their core business is not sending data to people. And they maybe like in a hedge fund, this might be like an alt data source, but these kinds of providers may not know how to enforce hygiene in any way, shape, or form. And as a downstream consumer of that, you're kind of eating up that baggage coming from the upstream company. What we're starting to think more about is how we view our users within a much broader value chain of data and how we can help them communicate better with the folks that are providing them information and take to them better kinds of practices, rules that help them better SLAs from the top.
Very cool. Do you think that these issues, is it specific or related to a size of an organization? Like Do you expect some issues to be more common with, let's say, comparing like a startup or like a small size business versus an enterprise organization? Caroyln, do you think that organizational size has an impact on these issues that you brought up?
Yeah, definitely. There's always outliers for sure, but the size and the maturity of an organization will like most often play into kind of the level of data quality, especially the number of staff, the amount of experience the staff has with the business, just how much the business understands itself and its own data. I think one thing that's a little bit different between engineers and analytics engineers, my end focuses a little bit more on kind of business process and business concepts as opposed to source systems and what's happening kind of at the source orientation. I think enterprise, sometimes enterprise runs the gamut. Sometimes you'll see like really sophisticated setups with really well-run data governance, which helps a lot, or you'll see just mountains and mountains of tech debt and legacy, like history of terrible data quality issues.
That makes sense. Josh, what do you think?
Absolutely, there are big differences. I think it's not a perfect correlation, but it's a pretty good directional one. We've definitely seen teams and worked with teams where it's a fairly, 2,000 person company, 5,000 person company, 500 person company. And if they're data oriented enough, like their core business is the data, we might see complexity there that you would see in a giant enterprise in the Fortune 1000 or 500. I think the level of complexity and the focus that a company puts on their data, the amount they're leaning into that, if their data is the actual product that they sell and they have customers associated with that data, these are all going to create drags on the business that create data quality requirements that put those kinds of organizations in a certain category. That would be big enterprises, and it would be probably like really data-oriented startups and scale-ups and mid-market companies. I think the other interesting thing about just the enterprise world is in the enterprise, I talked about this like data value chain where you have other companies giving you data and then your team working with that data. In the enterprise, you just have your own mini economy and value chain in there where we might see 6, 7, 8 more teams that are all feeding and reading data from one another and operating maybe in parallel. So just the complexity and the lineage there and the dependencies that you need to understand and help prioritize where to focus attention is something that I think is unique in that area of the market.
Very cool. We actually had a great question. Has anyone had success getting this team sport mentality established regarding data quality? What do I, a data engineer, do with findings of poor or suboptimal data quality from a source? When I suggest to a data owner or producer that the data should get fixed upstream or at the source, I get pushback because with things like DBT, I usually have the means to correct or reject bad data myself. So that just gets kicked down the road into the warehouse. So let's start with the first question. And I guess this would be addressed to both of you. Have you seen any success in getting a team sport mentality established in any of the teams that you might have worked on and bringing these different data teams together?
One thing I would say is, and this kind of lends itself to observability tools, but transparency and sunlight is kind of key. In the past, I have, based on the request of teams that struggle with data quality, built data products specifically around data quality so that they can understand where their quality issues are at a column level. How well are they doing? And even kind of narrowing down to individual contributors and owners of records to make sure that the quality is where they expect it to be. It doesn't work in all situations, but definitely would recommend transparency and sunlight and just making it front and center, making it hard to ignore.
Great advice. Josh, what do you think you would recommend in looking and encouraging a bit more of that data quality as a team sport mentality? What do you think?
I think sunlight as the first medicine, I think is the right way to go. But inside that, I think what we see work is when you can sit at the boundaries and you can see how data is being delivered in, if you're a data provider to another organization, how you are delivering data out. When you sit at the boundary between those organizations, you know what your inputs are, and you know what your outputs are of that overall analytical system, you can develop a better language for the problems that you bring to the providers, let's say, if they're causing you problems. So compare this to, you have a really big complex analytical system and you're looking in like one table that's in the middle of your flow and you're saying, it looks like we have some incompleteness here. Taking that to the upstream organization and saying, hey, I have this table in the middle of my warehouse in between a 40-step airflow DAG and it doesn't look right. They're not going to know how to communicate with you, the upstream organization, because they're going to point to you and they're going to say, well, it's probably those 70 transformations and queries that you're running before it. How do you know it's my problem? I don't mean to say that that layer is not important, because understanding how things are moving through helps you triage problems as well and track things down. But when you're in a complex organization, when you have a lot of these dependencies going in and out of your team, being able to sit at the boundaries and say, no, I can tell you right away, here's the histories of all the data deliveries that you've missed in the files or APIs that I'm grabbing or schema changes that are occurring. I can see those right at the source of where you're sending me the data. Coming with that kind of information is just convincing to be able to enforce change. I think there's part of this dynamic also going into the kind of second part of the question there is, how do you prevent, like, who owns this problem at the end of the day? It's going to feel different in different kinds of organizations and arrangements. It's probably easiest when you are the consuming team of an organization that has something on the line if you're upset, if that contract is in place. So like the easiest is they're a data provider that sells you data. You go to them and say, our Databand or whatever observability tool we're using, we can see you're changing your schema on us 4 times a week. We've been dealing with broken pipelines for the last 6 months. Now we finally understand, like, it's you. That's a convincing motivation for that provider to say, okay, I need to enforce better standards here. That can get a little more hairy in a big organization where the roles and responsibilities are not so clearly laid out and teams are operating more in parallel. But as close as you can get to that definition of responsibility, who owns what, and the contract between the organizations, formal or informal, I think that's what helps just bring some common language into how you face these problems.
We're about to come up on time, so I wanted to maybe give everyone a little bit of a takeaway, like an action step. What do you think is the most important action to take in order to keep data quality as a priority on your own respective teams?
A very good question. I would say collaboration is huge, at least from the analytics engineering perspective, just like communication across data teams. So it's even hard to think about, like, what is a data team? Oftentimes we will see data teams split across different business areas. And sometimes the kind of gaps between those different data teams that may sit in marketing versus product versus HR, the kind of space between is where oftentimes data quality issues might fall or become hidden. And also the space between kind of system architects and data owners. So I think creating cross-functional teams that address and manage kind of data governance and data quality issues, that cross-functional communication is really helpful for data quality and just general problem solving.
There's a lot of tools in this space. There's a lot of data tools out there. And what I would really recommend is, before you come and talk to folks like me, and before you go out and evaluate 30 different tools and spend a bunch of time, demoing and POCing and everything, you sit within your team and understand, where are data problems happening? What's your best idea of where they're happening? And have some sense of where you want to start, and have some big, at least, roadmap that tells you, okay, if we really want to make a big impact on our data quality, this feels like the place where we should be drawing our attention. As we talked about before, as best as you can to define who owns what and what are the responsibilities and who you expect to act on alerts that a solution like mine is going to start flagging you. Figure some of those questions out within the team and have some baseline for how you want to evaluate solutions that you may want to bring in, build yourself. Have some of that internal dialogue first and set up the right expectations, because there's just a lot of tools out there. And if you don't have good clarity, or at least some examples, some language to talk about where data quality issues are occurring, you may make investments that kind of point you in the wrong direction, or maybe just take a lot of time to get the value from. So that would be my real recommendation.
To piggyback on Josh's recommendation, want to throw in and kind of go back to that first question we had, use DBT source testing to do that initial exploration. Source testing is fantastic for that. To do super robust source testing is going to take a ton of time, but to do that initial exploration to see what you might need out of an observability tool, DBT source testing was great.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. That was such a fun discussion, and I'm really glad that you were both able to join us. And definitely, if you think of additional questions later on, feel free to put those into the local Texas channel in DBT Slack.